All right, welcome to episode 2 of Father Can Cook. The recipe today is Italian bread, monkey bread style, and we're going to do it a little different. It's going to be all voiceover, no live audio. We're going to see how that works. So if you're going to make bread, you need 3 things. You need water, you need yeast, and you need flour. I'm showing sugar in this picture also because I'm going to sugar the yeast mixture to get the yeast a little bit more active. Okay, so what we're doing is called blooming the yeast. Basically, we want the yeast to start making gas before we put it in with the dry ingredients. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a big lump of clay. So the yeast goes into a cup of warm water, pretty warm, like tap water full hot, basically. And then there's my teaspoon. We're going to add a couple of teaspoons of sugar to this. To give the yeast something to eat so they can really get active. And we're going to stir that out. You can notice that I'm using rapid rise yeast. I honestly don't see much of a difference between active dry yeast and rapid rise yeast. I'll do this recipe either way. All right, time to talk about equipment again, and yes, it's another KitchenAid. This is a KitchenAid stand mixer, and no, they're not a sponsor, at least not yet. A KitchenAid stand mixer is a big, powerful motor on a pretty heavy-duty hinge with attachments that fit. I've had this one 17 years, I'm guessing. Never had a problem with it. The dough hook is what's on there now, and that's what we're going to be using to make the bread dough. This thing is awesome. Okay, so now we're gonna oil our flour, and we've got about 2 cups of all-purpose flour in here at the moment. That's one of the main differences between French bread and Italian bread is whether you oil your flour in the beginning. The other really is whether you sugar your yeast. In an Italian you do, and in a French you typically don't. There's one more we'll talk about later. I'm gonna put about a tablespoon of oil in here now, and just let that mix in with these 2 cups of flour. There'll be more flour to come later. All right, so you look at our yeast and you can see it's got a nice head on it. That's the yeast eating the sugar, making gas. It's active, it's ready to do its thing. Note, if when you come back over to this yeast mixture, if the head's not there, wash out that container and do it again with more yeast and more sugar because you're gonna end up with a bad result. But this looks sort of like a freshly poured glass of beer. That means we're ready to rock. Okay, so it's time to add yeast to flour. So we're going to pour our yeast mixture into what is currently 2 cups of flour. Again, we'll add flour later and I'll explain that. You see when you finish pouring this in, a lot of those little yeasties are stuck to the inside of my measuring cup. So I'm going to run over to the sink, again with tap hot water, and try to collect as much of it as I can, and then take that back and pour it back in. Now you would think this would throw off some ratio, but the ratio it would throw off is the flour part, and we're not done adding flour yet. You can see that we end up with a pool in the middle, so stop the mixer, go in and sort of scrape down the edges, get everything working together again. And then you can turn the mixer back on, and you'll start creating sort of what I would call a mixture between a batter and a dough. A dough is something you can handle, and this isn't really going to be handling yet, but it's definitely going to be thicker than a batter. Okay, you can see that that looks sort of like a batter. It's time to add the rest of the flour. The recipe is going to say 2.5 to 3.5 cups of flour, and how do you know how much? Well, we're going to show you during this part. So I'm going to take a 1/4 cup measure. Remember, we've only done 2 cups so far. And I'm going to put in a 1/4 cup, and then I'm going to give it some time. Now, the amount of time varies. It's going to be on the order of a minute or 2 for that flour to incorporate. And you're going to keep doing this. So the first 2 times I use a 1/4 cup, and then after that I start using portions of the 1/4 cup. So once that flour is incorporated, it's time to put some more in, right? So at this point I'm up to 2.5 cups of flour in there. And you can see down on the bottom it's kind of raggedy. That's what I call the state change. So it goes from looking like there's extra flour around the dough to that state change, that raggedy state change, to now I have dough, but there's that disc on the bottom that's not pulling up, and that's what we're going to try to make go away now. So now we're going to start using portions of the quarter cup. So in this case I did about half of a quarter cup, so that's about an eighth of a cup, and we're going to put that in there. And right, it looks like there's a bunch of flour around my dough, and then eventually there's a state change, and then eventually it's all incorporated, and that disc is still there. It's smaller, but there's still that dough that's stuck on the bottom. So I want to go with a little bit more flour, and in this case I'm going to use about a third of a quarter of a cup, so I guess that's about a twelfth of a cup, and throw that in there. And we're going to let this video run so you can see the whole state change. So right now it's just dough and flour that aren't mixed, and then as they pound together on this dough hook, we're eventually going to go to that raggedy state, where there's like little strings of dough hanging off the dough, and that's what I call the state change. Don't jump in the middle of that, let it keep going. And see, we're starting to reach the raggedy state here as it's trying to pick up that flour, and then eventually in this case it's going to pick up all the dough from the bottom of the bowl, and we will have a big ball of dough on the hook and nothing else. And honestly, if I were trying to do this by hand, I'm not sure what technique I would use to know that I have the right amount of flour given the amount of liquid that I used. This way, with this mixer, I can tell when I've picked up the dough off the bottom, I have the right amount of flour. So now it's time to knead the dough, and if you're a traditionalist and want to put this on a flat surface and knead by hand, be my guest. I have a nice machine, I'm going to let it do the work. So I go from speed 1, which I've done all the work on up to this point, and I'm going to go to speed 2, and I'm going to leave it on speed 2 for about 4 to 5 minutes to really work that dough into a nice tight ball, and then I'll be done with kneading, and it's time to start proofing. All right, this is my favorite proofing vessel here. It's a nice aluminum work bowl. I'm going to coat it with a neutral oil. In this case, I absolutely could have used a nice extra virgin olive oil because it's an Italian bread. But we're going to go ahead and coat this thing nicely, and then we're going to transfer our dough. Okay, not great film work by me because as you're going to see, you're not going to be able to see what I'm doing to the dough. But as I come out of the mixing bowl, I'm basically working this ball into a ball, right? So I'm pushing down the sides underneath the bottom and pushing the bottom back up into the middle, making a nice tight ball. Honestly, I don't know that this has any real value other than it's what most people do. So that's going to go into that lightly oiled work bowl, and then it's going to be time to cover this. When you're proofing, you don't want any drafts on your dough. So in this case, I'm going to cover with aluminum foil. If I were going to proof on my countertop, I would use plastic wrap because it's a better seal. But I'm going to proof in an oven in this case, and I don't like putting plastic in an oven even though the oven's only going to be at 90 degrees. So I got this thing covered, and now I'm going to go over to my tabletop oven and proof this thing at 90 degrees. The tabletop oven proofs in hour-long cycles. So after an hour, I will check this. All right, let's take a quick time out and talk about proofing here. I'm going to proof at 90 degrees in this little tabletop oven, but you can proof at refrigerator temperatures if you want. It's just going to take longer, right? So the warmer the proof is, the faster the proof is going to go. We're looking for tripling the size of the dough over the course of the proof time. So I like to proof in this tabletop oven because I get there quicker. But I could have easily done this the night before, put it in the fridge. 12 hours later, I probably would have had what I wanted. Okay, so after about an hour of proofing, I am at about triple the amount of dough. So maybe rapid rise yeast is faster because I would have expected this first proof to take maybe 2 hours. But we're there, which means we're ready to punch down. Okay, it's called punching down, but there's no punching. All you're going to do is pull the dough off the sides of the vessel. You're going to release some of the gas that's trapped inside of the dough, and you're basically going to reduce the size of the ball by about half, and then you're going to be ready to proof again. So I'll put the foil back on, put it back in the proofing oven again. I'm going to give it another hour, and this time we're looking for doubling the size, or basically getting back to the size before we punch down. So after that second proof, we're back to the larger size again, which means we're done with our second proof. There's one more proof to go, and there won't be any kind of punch down or manipulation after that one, because it's going to be in the vessel where it's going to get baked. Okay, it's time to go into a baking vessel. I have picked this heart-shaped springform, A, because it's kind of cute, and B, because springforms are a nice way to make monkey-style bread, because you can open them up and get things out. So I'm going to put a light coating of neutral oil around this springform, and then I am going to start creating little tiny dough balls that I roll up into a tight little ball of dough by itself and place around this springform. So monkey breads are often sweet and desserty, and this is not the case, right? This is plain old Italian bread, but it's made with the monkey bread style, and that makes it sort of a fun pull-apart bread that you can, serve as an appetizer, or have on the table when you're having a beverage or whatever you like. Okay, so we need to do one more proof, and that's going to be in this baking vessel. So we're doing a 3-proof method. You'll find some recipes that sort of skip the middle proof. I find that if you do all 3, you end up with a lighter, fluffier bread. So I'm going to stick with 3. This one I only do for about half an hour. Also note that if you're not going to proof in an oven, you're going to proof on your countertop, that's fine. Just know that the proof is probably going to take about twice as long. The other thing you don't want to do is be sitting on a metal or stone surface like a granite countertop. So that's going to suck heat out of your bowl. So fold up a towel and sit it on it, or sit it on a wooden cutting board, so you're not sucking the heat out of your bowl. All right, third proof complete. So now it's time to dress the top of this before we bake it. You can see that it has risen to the point that it's filled in quite nicely. We're going to do an egg wash on the top, and this is the third difference between an Italian bread and a French bread. French bread, the only thing you should put on top is a little bit of water. But an Italian bread, you do a little bit of egg wash, and you can put some seasonings on top if you want to also. So we're going to mix this up, and then we're going to hit it with some dried oregano and a little bit of kosher salt, and then we'll be ready to head to the oven. So when we go to the oven, you see I've included this oven-safe ramekin with a little bit of water in it. A commercial baking oven has a steam system, and I'm just replicating that with the ability to have some water in there. Okay, half an hour, 370, and here's your result. A nice fluffy Italian bread, monkey bread style, easy to pull apart and serve however you like. I like mixing a couple tablespoons of melted butter with a couple tablespoons of olive oil and maybe a shake or two of kosher salt, and then dipping these little bad boys in it. Really quite delicious. Hope you enjoyed the show.